Right. Good day, everyone. So, since some people are still slowly joining in, but yeah, anyway, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Coffee Science Seminar webinar series. Denise, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So welcome everyone. So today we'll be having a seminar series, a seminar talk by Denise Bond, who is from the Macadamia Conservation Trust. And next slide, please, Denise. Thank you. So my name is Albert Pong. So I'll be the facilitator for today's seminar talk. And so I'm currently a postdoc research fellow working in the Center for Horticultural Science, currently working on tissue culture of macadamia, an ARC project with in coffee, and also with other collaborators such as Denise from MCT. Next slide, please, Denise. Thank you. So before we start today's seminar series, I would like to acknowledge to read out the acknowledgement of the country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the traditional owners, I pay respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So just a little bit of housekeeping things to mention for today. This seminar series is scheduled to run from 12 to 1. And at the conclusion of this seminar, we will hold a Q&A session. So if you have any questions that you would like answered, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen usually, and not the chat button. And then we will address them at the conclusion of the seminar. So I would like to welcome Denise, who is the speaker for today's seminar series. So Denise works with trees and people with qualifications in Australian environmental studies, social change and development. She campaigned to protect the Franklin River and Wet Tropics World Heritage Forest, then worked with the Forestry Department and Queensland farmers to integrate trees into farms, the right tree in the right place, for the right reason. For 10 years, Denise and family live in Nepal, Uganda and Palau, working on community land and sea management projects. As executive officer of the Macadamia Conservation Trust, she works to conserve macadamia species and their habitat, conserving the source of Australia's gift to the world. And I would like to also thank Denise for her contribution in my current work with macadamia, and also her valuable suggestion and contributions in my recent research proposal that I submitted to the Australia Flora Foundation. So we'd like to really warmly welcome Denise today for giving today's seminar talk, and I'll hand it over to you, Denise. Sorry, Denise. I think you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Albert, and welcome everybody. And I hope to explain a little bit today why macadamia conservation is complicated in some ways. I would like to add to Albert's acknowledgement of country to say that the Macadamia Conservation Trust also acknowledges the traditional owners and their continuing custodianship and cultural and spiritual connections to country. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Widjabul people, and other traditional owners of macadamia habitat include the Gurang, Gurung, Kabi, Jinibara, Turrbal, Danganbolan, and Bunjalung people. So the driver for macadamia conservation is clear. In fewer than 200 years, we have cleared 80 to 95% of the habitat for macadamia species, and we want to protect as much of the original genetic diversity as we can. Some of the challenges and opportunities that macadamia habitat is now highly sought after as real estate. It's in the spotlight as a commercial and much loved food crop, and it is now part of the global larder grown in many countries. There are people in the audience who know a lot more, or there may be, about macadamias than I do, but I'm also hoping there are people who are not working on macadamias and might like a quick rundown on a quick overview of macadamias. So macadamias are Australian. They're restricted to a small area of Australia's east coast. They're a rainforest species, sort of mid-canopy rainforest species, and they're from the ancient line of Proteaceae. What excites me about them being a Proteaceae is it means that they diverged from the majority of flowering plants a long time ago. The last common ancestor of macadamias and most other commercial nut species lived about 130 million years ago. And that's even earlier than marsupials split off from the rest of the mammals. So there are many elements of macadamias and other Proteaceae that look similar to other trees, but they've been evolving separately for over 130 million years, and they may use quite different mechanisms to perform similar functions. So a review of the taxonomic classification of the branch of Proteaceae that macadamias are in by Austin Mast, Peter Weston and Catherine Downs placed the 5 tropical macadamias in a new genus last year. So we used to talk about 9 macadamia species, but 5 of them have been hived off into a separate genus. And fascinatingly, they found that 2 other related genuses, Panopsis in Central and Southern America, and a single species of Brabbigium in South Africa, are more closely related to the 4 macadamias, or as closely related as they are to Lasgia, and more closely related to any of the other Proteaceae. So the theory is that ancestors of these species rafted from Australia in flood debris, got caught up in the Antarctic circumpolar current, and were deposited on the shores of the American and African continents between 23 to 25 million years ago, because they've somehow got there well after Gondwana split into the separate continents. So now we have the 4 species, and they really have contracted to a very small section of the East Australian coast from Miriam Vale, just north of Bundaberg, and down to the Richmond River in Lismore. Along that small strip of subtropical forest, we've cleared over 80% of the habitat and over 90% for Macadamia tetraphylla, which is the northern New South Wales species. So I'll just run quickly through the species. Macadamia ternifolia was the first to be named and described by colonial botanists. The tern refers to 3 leaves per whorl. Macadamia leaves grow in whorls along the stem. As you can see, it's a pretty bushy habit, although if it's planted in the open, it can grow a single trunk, just like the other species. So Macadamia integrifolia is the species that we grow in commercial orchards in Australia. And there were decades of confusion between Macadamia ternifolia and integrifolia, leading to lots of historical records where you're not quite sure which species they're talking about. Hours of harmless amusement. And integrifolia can grow into a magnificent rainforest tree. This is in McConaughey, the founder of the Macadamia Conservation Trust, with the oldest known planted tree in Australia, the Walter Hill tree in the Brisbane Botanic Gardens. It's 165 years old this year. Macadamia tetraphylla is most closely related to Macadamia integrifolia. It grows from the Queensland, New South Wales border down to the Gold Coast hinterland down to the Richmond River. It has 4 leaves, that's the tetraphylla, 4 leaves per whorl, or 5 or 3, just to confuse you in the bush. And it has the most magnificent new flush, beautiful velvety, pinky red new flush, although sometimes waxy smooth like Integra Folia as well. So quite a lot of variation. It also has a delicious nut with a slightly higher sugar content than Macadamia Integra Folia, widely grown in South Africa, or at least a hybrid between Integra Folia and Tetraphylla. Macadamia Janceni was the last species to be found and named by Western botanists. It has a very restricted habitat. In fact, there are only about 60 mature adult trees that have ever been found. So it is critically endangered. So let's consider the extent of macadamia habitat under the management of Australia's First Nations, compared with the habitat that remains after fewer than 200 years of foreign occupation. Since invasion, 80 to 95% of the forest has been cleared. And we've learned little to nothing about what existed in these forests from the people who lived with them for thousands of years. Aboriginal people showed colonisers that macadamia nuts were edible and even traded nuts with the early settlers. Colonial botanists were then quick to show macadamias off around the world with a "look what we found" attitude, rather than "look what we've been shown." So, as I said at the beginning, being Australia's best known native food export brings challenges and opportunities. So I think we need to address the following questions. Who has the right to profit from a species that evolved on land that has never been seeded? What can we learn about macadamias from observing them in the wild? And what can be learned collaboratively with people who lived with them for tens of thousands of years? How does Australia meet its responsibilities to look after the crop wild relatives of macadamia for Australia and globally? So, looking at who has the right to profit from the species, I know that better approaches are being developed for commercialising native species, such as those at the UQ Centre for Uniquely Australian Foods. But I reckon macadamia needs a unique approach to resolve the convoluted historical path to commercialisation. Early colonisers did try to farm the nuts, but without much success. And it took a different country to uncover their horticultural potential, a country with fewer macadamia-loving insects, which enabled them to grow a commercial volume of nuts, and with access to a bigger pool of mechanics who were able to invent ways to efficiently dehusk and crack the nuts. From this circuitous beginning via Hawaii, macadamias are now a small but definitely global crop, and arguably the most significant Australian contribution so far to the global larder. We market macadamias as Australia's gift to the world, but this is without the free, prior and informed consent of the people who have the moral right to make that gift. Historically, macadamia was appropriated by the British in the same way they took the land macadamias grew on. Unravelling the details across 2 species via Hawaii and now globally would be very difficult. But in the spirit of reconciliation, surely we can work out an appropriate shared approach to developing macadamia's future potential. So the rest of the world is addressing this issue, and the Nagoya Protocol is an international agreement which aims at sharing benefits arising from the use of genetic resources in a fair and equitable way. It also covers traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources covered by the Convention on Biological Diversity and the benefits arising from such traditional knowledge. As you can see, there are 140 parties to the Nagoya Protocol, all the countries in green. And Australia, despite having signed up to the protocol in 2012, is still not a party to the protocol, but most of the European countries are. I don't think that anyone would claim that macadamias, our main native food crop, were accessed with free, prior and informed consent from the people who first discovered and used it, or that there's been a fair and equitable sharing of benefits with these people. And yet macadamias are clearly a lucrative industry with an annual farm gate value of 200 to 300 million, possibly not this year. One argument against complying with the protocol is that it's complicated and challenging to get right. And yet, as with many things, once the frameworks and mechanisms are established, it will get progressively easier. The Convention on Biological Diversity has set up an access and benefit sharing clearinghouse as a tool for countries to share knowledge, experience, and to grow their capacity. A toolkit of experience which has been amassing now for over a decade. Another argument is knowing who to engage with. And this is the most cruel block of all, because the greater the impacts that invasion has had on an Indigenous community, the harder it can be for that community to prove who they are and to negotiate their rights. The impact of invasion and occupation along the east coast of Australia had a major impact on the First Nations that live here, and meaningful attempts at reconciliation are only just beginning. Mitigating the impact of forced removal, stolen generations, and the systematic destruction of language and oral history records has to be done at a government level. There are also long-term institutions that have a critical role: First Nations organisations, universities, and the public service, particularly agencies like the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. These institutions have the human resources to grapple with this challenge and come up with solutions to government policy. Some of the problems highlighted by a 2014 review of the Native Title Act by the Australian Law Reform Commission are that claimants in native title legislation suffer from the disadvantage that, in the absence of a written tradition, there are no Indigenous documentary records that enable the court to ascertain the laws and customs followed by Aboriginal people at sovereignty. Early records made by European amateur and professional ethnographers are limited by the ethnocentric views of the writers and by the limits on their understanding of the language and culture of those about whom they wrote. Further, they found that the Native Title Act does not clearly specify that native title rights and interests can be of a commercial nature. In fact, the Commission was of the view that economic development for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is hindered by obstacles in the native title system. The very concept of benefit sharing is culturally specific, with Western cultures tending to assume individual benefits and many Indigenous cultures assuming community benefits. This makes addressing the issues of consent and benefit sharing challenging for individual farmers and Aboriginal people alike, and well outside the skill set of industry bodies and conservation groups. And yet, this is an issue that is fundamental to the Australian nation. Another reason for it to be addressed at a government level, even though this means that it is prone to politics, as can be seen with the current debate over the voice to Parliament. It's important to remember that legislation is not set in stone. In fact, much of it is quite recent in Australia. In the early 1800s, the new settlements were pretty lawless places. And in the 1840s, when people discovered the amazing timber in red cedars, subtropical rainforest clearing began in earnest as people followed the search for red gold, and then the governments came after them, facilitating clearing for agriculture. By 1875, the rate of clearing was so severe that botanist Walter Hill recommended the reservation of forest areas by the government, but he was ignored. It took until 1959 for Queensland to create a forestry department with independent legislation to create and control the reservation of forestry areas. There had been a forestry body before that, but it was always under and subservient to the Lands Department. In 1975, it wasn't until 1975 that a Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service was formed, with the idea of actually preserving some representative lands of the natural resources in Queensland. Previously, national parks had been pretty much preserving scenic areas and places for picnics. In 1993, the Native Title Act was declared. And in 1997, the first Indigenous protected area was declared. And this showed the dawning recognition by non-Indigenous Australians that instead of wilderness, there is actually country. Current legislation, however, is still based on a false dichotomy between wild species that exist separately from humans and cultivated species that can be exploited by humans. This dichotomy is based on an outdated assumption that Aboriginal Australians had no impact on the landscape they inhabited and the species they exploited. To protect Australia's biodiversity into a future of climate change and population growth, we need a more sophisticated approach, one that learns from First Nations experience and can incorporate both protection and fair exploitation of any species, cutting off the vectors for weed invasion and managing the interactions between genetic diversity and commercial cultivars. As shown in the previous, up to the beginning. Researchers and the public servants charged with managing natural resources have always played a critical role in forming and amending legislation in line with changing public ethics and concerns. Sometimes they even manage to curb the excesses of private industry and big business. As shown in the previous slide, it was Walter Hill, one of the earliest macadamia enthusiasts, who was the first back in 1875 to recommend reservation of state forests for reforestation and scientific research to be paid for by a timber export duty. The government of the day was enthralled to those making obscene profits from mining Queensland's forests for timber. And it was not until over 80 years later, in 1859, that the Forestry Department, with independent legislation to control reservation of forestry areas, was created. All this is to suggest that macadamia researchers should be proactive in reconciling the ongoing development of the macadamia industry with the wishes of the First Nations people who were the first land managers and consumers of macadamias. I think there would be an immense amount of goodwill to finding an approach that will inevitably involve compromise, but has every opportunity to be a win-win situation for research, the industry, and for today's First Nations people. So what can be learned about macadamias from observing them in the wild, and what can be learned collaboratively with the people who lived with them for tens of thousands of years? Macadamias have survived ice ages, sea level and climate change, and have had to retreat into contracting forest habitats. Added to the impacts of these changes, for the most recent tens of thousands of years, the landscape has been purposefully managed by humans. What do I mean by this? When the invaders first traveled through forested landscapes, they remarked on the presence of grassy patches throughout the forests. In the wet tropics, these were called pockets and became the sites of some of the first settlements. In northern New South Wales, they were called grasses and survive today in locality names, almost indistinguishable from the rest of the cleared landscape. On the Atherton tablelands, at least, it is well documented that these pockets were managed as hunting grounds by traditional owners and were often surrounded by nut trees, not of macadamias, but of prolifically fruiting nuts like yellow and black walnut, black pine, and black bean, some of which involve complex processing to leach out the poisons but which then provided a rich source of digestible carbohydrates. There's a growing understanding of the way that fire has been used to manage the landscape and maintain a mix of plant communities by First Nations people. The impact of managing the competition between rainforest and sclerophyll forests is forcibly illustrated by the fate of redstringy bark and the yellow-bellied gliders that depend on them in the Daintree. In 2017, I was lucky enough to be helicoptered into the headwaters of the Daintree River to participate in the census of yellow-bellied gliders. The forest was relatively open, wet sclerophyll, dominated by towering rose gums and red stringy bark, also called red mahogany. It's the stringy bark that the gliders depend on, biting away small patches of bark and then licking up the sap as it oozes out. Each family group establishes territory with enough trees to sustain them. Over time, as the eucalypts form a canopy, the grassy understory is colonized by rainforest species, making it too dark for the eucalypts to reproduce. If the understory is not managed with fire, it will either be incorporated into the rainforest as the sclerophyll species die out, or it will be subjected to a very hot wildfire, which will reset the sclerophyll community, but in a very destructive way. Under current fire management regimes, this vulnerable border of wet sclerophyll forest is being choked out by rainforest species, decreasing habitat for the fluffy gliders. But as researchers start asking the right questions, there is increasing evidence of how First Nations peoples used fire to manage the distribution of different vegetation communities over time. Roughly half of Macadamia tetraphylla habitat is in the area named somewhat dismissively as the Big Scrub. The 75,000 hectares of the Big Scrub is described proudly but sadly today as the largest expanse of lowland subtropical rainforest in Australia, tragically cleared by European settlers so that only about 1% remains in scattered remnants. The Big Scrub was crisscrossed with walking tracks and grassy clearings that were managed by fire. These became the grasses that were often named after the settlers who first exploited them for cattle and cropping. To my knowledge, no one has ever looked to see if there's any relationship between macadamia distribution and these cleared areas, either in New South Wales or Queensland, let alone at the flavour profile of macadamias along high-use areas compared with closed forest. What is the potential flavour profile? Have we missed out on 1,000 years of intensive selection for flavour that might have influenced, say, the almonds we eat today? Or have we already benefited from selection over tens of thousands of years? Or is there just a potential here that has been overlooked? There are so many ideas, but how much better would it be if we embarked on these investigations in collaboration with First Nations people? Other research topics that would inform conservation include: what are the main pollinators in the wild? Researcher James Mackinson from Western Sydney University camped out in the forest to investigate this, but nothing's been published yet. We also could look more closely at the soil from macadamia habitat sites and consider what influence the soil and the soil microbiome has on tree survival. And also, particularly, how does the soil and microbiome interact with the function of proteoid roots? Another thing we don't know much about is how seeds were dispersed before invasion and the decimation of small native mammals. And in the face of this decimation, does adequate seed dispersal continue? Or what part do birds such as cockatoos play? Most of these research topics would also inform commercial macadamia growing. For example, research into the influence of soil and the soil microbiome on tree productivity on how it influences tree productivity and the flavour, oil content and shelf life of nuts. So in exchange for the work that other countries do to preserve the wild relatives of many of the crops that we depend on, rice, wheat, soy, lentils, etc., and I know that Australia also has wild relatives of some of these crops. To play our part as global farmers, we need to protect the crop wild relatives of the species that we contribute to the world larder. Because at the moment, we don't really meet our responsibilities to look after the crop wild relatives of macadamia. We're the sole guardian of the remaining, I will just start that again. Australia's sole guardian of the remaining genetic diversity of the Macadamia genus. We're signatory to the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, which seeks to recognise the contribution of farmers and establish a global system to provide farmers and plant breeders and scientists with access to plant genetic materials, and to ensure that the recipients share benefits they derive from the use of those genetic materials with the countries where they originated. The treaty also provides guidelines for the conservation and sustainable use of crop wild relatives and wild food plants. So we're a signatory to that, and that's the driver for us looking after the crop wild relatives, not only for Australia, but as our part in looking after a global resource. So to be able to do that, we need to know where the genetic diversity is, how it's distributed across the geographic range of remaining habitat, and we found a number of interesting things so far. I'd like to acknowledge the growing body of genetic research on wild macadamias. Some of the names I know are Cameron Peace, Craig Hardner, Robert Henry, Kathy Knock, Bruce Topp, Mobashwa Alam, Jodie Neal, Michael Powell, Alison Shapcott, Katie O'Connor, and Tui May. And I know that I'm not including everyone. Kathy Knock recently assembled the largest collection of wild macadamia samples so far to further explore the genetic diversity and population structure of wild and domesticated macadamias. Thanks to this work, we are in the process of restoring clade 4 that until now was only known from a couple of planted trees. So we're finding all the remaining trees that have clade 4 genetics in them and planting them back into the landscape. As for Macadamia tetraphylla, we found out that it actually has the highest genetic diversity of the 4 species. That diversity is less aligned with geography, probably because it was a more contiguous habitat across the landscape. However, now there are smaller remnant patches than either Integra Folia or Turnifolia, and many of those remnants are close enough to commercial plantations to be impacted by them. So it's very important that we replant wild Macadamia tetraphylla into the landscape. With Macadamia turnifolia, there hasn't been enough sampled yet to really tell much about its distribution of genetic diversity, but it's probably more likely to be like Macadamia tetraphylla. It's not as strung out as Macadamia Integra Folia. And as for Macadamia Janceni I, DNA has been collected for all the known mature trees for Macadamia Janceni I, and analysis has shown that of the trees that we have planted in an ex situ location, about 85% of that genetic diversity is captured in those in the insurance population, but novel alleles representing about 15% of the diversity only exist in about 20 mature trees growing in the vulnerable wild habitat. And that's the end of the habitat that was burnt a couple of years ago, or nearly burnt a couple of years ago. So I feel that is quite a vulnerability for Macadamia Janceni I. So macadamia conservation efforts are coordinated through a macadamia species recovery plan and team, which is recognised at the Commonwealth by the Commonwealth Government, currently waiting for the updated plan to be adopted. The recovery team undertakes to review the macadamia conservation activities once a year and assess their impact and plan for activities in the next year. Currently, Macadamia Integra Folia is seen as the best protected macadamia, but on a downward trend, mainly due to invasive weed species. Macadamia ternifolia and tetraphylla are both poor and also on a downward trend. In fact, both those species have been recognised by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as being endangered. And Macadamia Janceni I is very poor and downward because it's so restricted. It's actually entirely within a national park, and there is quite a lot of management involved since the bushfires to try and protect that national park from future bushfires and to control pigs and cat's claw. But despite that work, it's still very vulnerable. So the main objectives of the recovery plan are to continue to identify and evaluate the extent and quality of macadamia species populations and their habitat. We always want to know more, but we know plenty now to justify the conservation actions, which is to protect all the remaining habitat. Research in this area is nice to know rather than critical. It is critical for monitoring, and we are pursuing that. The critical action is to reduce and manage the major threatening processes that affect macadamia species and their habitat. So that's where most of the conservation effort goes. And to increase the knowledge of macadamia species and their ecology to affect their conservation and management. This is the area where most research is needed. And improve awareness and understanding of macadamia species, especially their conservation management requirements and major threats. And the value of this is so that people know about macadamia and what's needed to protect them. So we've had some good progress on this, and part of that has led to the recognition that seed storage for macadamias is not possible in using traditional methods. Large fatty seeds don't store well over time, and has led to the current work currently being done by members of the QAFI team, and including the work that Albert's looking at doing for Macadamia Janceni I. So all the research that could still be done would be better in the context of access and benefit sharing. So apart from the need to involve First Nations people, the most complicated aspect of macadamia conservation is this. To grow speeds commercially, whether for agriculture or amenity planting, we select genotypes that will grow easily and thrive where we plant them. Once we are onto a winner, we clone it and send it far and wide. For species that preferentially cross-pollinate, like macadamias, the wild trees may end up surrounded by these clones, and over a worryingly small number of generations, the percentage of diverse DNA from the wild seed parent could be down to 12.5%, roughly, a small amount. So This challenge is being, this has been proved to happen but through Dr. Katie O'Connor's research on Macadamia tetraphylla, where she looked at seedlings growing under wild tetraphylla and showed that they had parentage from neighbouring orchard trees. And this isn't a challenge that's unique to macadamias. It's being addressed for many species through the population genetics research to guide selection of genotypes for restoration plantings. As an example, the Science Saving Rainforests at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney, which is working with the Big Scrub conservation group. What the concern for the Big Scrub restoration effort was that they were effectively planting a very restricted number of clones back into the forest and possibly contributing to reducing genetic diversity in the very forests that they were trying to save. Once we have found out, once we've established where the genetic diversity is and got it growing in ex situ locations, the logistics of growing and distributing selected genotypes and getting them planted in the right places is a huge challenge that will be one of the biggest jobs for conservation. So protecting remaining macadamia habitat and genetic diversity is not as simple as fencing off habitat and planting macadamias in rainforest restoration projects. The gene flow from commercial species to wild species needs to be managed and monitored. We need to collaborate with traditional owners and custodians to respect and learn from traditional approaches to macadamia management. We need to maintain the living collections of existing genetic diversity, and we need to have some ex situ representatives of this. We also need to develop and maintain seed banking techniques, and we need to collaborate with other rainforest conservation efforts to control the invasive vines and fire-encouraging weeds like lantana. And this is a huge challenge faced by all rainforest conservation efforts. As cheaper genetic testing is developed, we'll be able to use it to improve our understanding of macadamia population genetics, monitor the survival of genetic diversity, and anticipate the need for climate change adaptations. In conclusion, to realise the full potential of macadamias, the Australian government needs to invite the involvement of traditional owners and seek their free, prior and informed consent for the ongoing development of macadamias. This process will also contribute to developing a fair and equitable approach to learning about and benefiting from other Australian native species. For conservation, we know what needs to be done. A greater understanding of macadamia species ecology would help us understand better how to do it. And finally, current conservation legislation is not fit for purpose and needs to mature in order to incorporate traditional owner rights and knowledge and to protect biodiversity in a way that can also facilitate the use of native species. Thank you. Now over to Albert for questions.
All right, I think on behalf of the audience here, I would like to really thank Denise for her insights into macadamia conservation. And we are now open for Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want answered, please fill them in the Q&A panel. And then I'll probably give everyone 1 or 2 minutes to start typing in questions if you have any. So while we're still waiting for some questions coming in, I have one question for you, Denise. When I look at the map of the distribution of the 4 macadamia species, I'm just wondering, further north of Bopper and further north from there onwards, have you all managed to see any other more population, more macadamia species population further north of Pauper?
So as far as we know, the Macadamia Integra Folia doesn't grow any further north than Mount Boppel. But there is the tiny Macadamia Janceni I that grows about 150k further north, which is quite a big gap between the other three species, which all overlap. They all have habitats that overlap, and then you have this big gap, and it's not as if there's absolutely no subtropical forest between over that 150 kilometers. But where Macadamia Janceni I grows is a big significant area of forest, and maybe they have just retreated to that over time.
Thanks, Denise. Yes, so we have some questions now. I'll just read out the first question that I have. So we have a question. I'll just read it out. Yeah. I was wondering what is known about co-cultivation with other species in the commercial field. Is there something to learn from the wild macadamia?
Sorry, about what cultivation?
I was wondering what is known about co-cultivation with other species in the commercial field.
To my knowledge, macadamia interbreeds amongst all 4 macadamia species, and I don't know if there has been any research into crossing with the next closest relatives. That would indeed be an interesting thing to investigate, and I do know that at least one of the Lasgia species has edible nuts, and as do some of the Panopsis species in South America. So I suspect there could be some interesting findings in looking at the next closest species to macadamia. Sorry, I'll just add that it's Macadamia Integra Folia and Tetraphylla are the most common crosses, but there is one commercial species that has some Macadamia ternifolia. To my knowledge, only one commercial species has a mix of all 3 species.
Sorry. So just to follow up on that question earlier, I think that the person meant to grow them together with, like, for example, a coffee crop.
I think people have looked at that, but not to any great extent. They were originally interplanted with bananas, so sometimes it's actually quite hard to find out whether you're looking at some wild habitat or whether you're looking at an abandoned banana and macadamia farm in the Northern Rivers. But I think commercially they are starting now to look at interplanting with pollinating grasses and plants that will improve the soil, but to my knowledge, not interplanted with other tree crops.
Right. Thanks, Denise. So we have another question here. It says, what do you know about native pollination of macadamia? For example, pollination by native stingless bee versus pollination by European honeybees.
I'm so unqualified to answer these questions, but just as a layperson, I know that native stingless bees are being promoted as pollinators of macadamias, and traditionally macadamia farms have used European bees, but now a number of farms are transitioning to have native bees instead of European bees. There are also a number of other insects that pollinate macadamia, such as hoverflies, and that's when I was talking. I think a lot of the research has been done in orchards, but possibly not much research actually going into the forest to see what Australian native species are pollinating in the wild. I do know that James went out a couple of years ago, but yeah, haven't seen any results from that. So yeah, my understanding is that the native bees are better designed to pollinate than European bees, but that actually a lot of pollination happens from European bees sort of bumbling around, even though they're too big to get in the flowers. And there's probably other insects that could still be investigated.
And we have another question here. So the question is, how worried are you for the remaining wild macadamia with climate change? And could this mean exploring new suitable habitat locations?
Yes, climate change is a worry. The trick would be where to go. So that's something that there was a paper on looking into this aspect, and I think it found that some species were more vulnerable than others, and indicated what we should be looking at in terms of moving the habitat further north or further south, or higher or lower. So that is something that we look at for long-term planning. Yeah, no, it's definitely a concern. I think it's also one reason why protection of the greatest amount of existing diversity as we can is important, so that if there's existing evolutionary capacity to deal with different climates, drier climates, hotter climates, that we make sure we don't lose them through clearing.
Right. I think we have one last question. So this question, I think, is quite general. This person is trying to know how to grow macadamia by seeds, and if by grafting, which is the common rootstocks that are used in Australia.
So growing macadamia from seeds is really easy. And there's lots of resources online as to how to do it, but they pop up everywhere. So I don't think it's very hard. Grafting, most commercial macadamias are grown through grafting, and there are a couple of preferred rootstocks. Again, that actually differs by country, but in Australia, the H2 and Beaumont are the preferred rootstocks. And there's a lot of information through the Australian Macadamia Society, and I think in other similar industry bodies in different countries throughout the world.
Sorry, Denise, I think there's one more last question. I think it's interesting. I just want to read this out. So, would you be in favor to use macadamia to recultivate post-mining land? Do you think that is possible given the poor soil quality?
I don't think there's any reason not to, if it would be successful. I think it very much would depend on the capacity of the soil and the rainfall and all the conditions, whether macadamia would be suitable or not. I can't see why it shouldn't be considered as well as any other species.
I think that's all for today's Q&A session. So thank you again, Denise, for giving us such a exciting talk for today's seminar series. And I think, is there a next slide, Denise? Yep, thank you. So next week's seminar will be on Tuesday, 15th August, and the title will be on Retracing Footsteps, Exploring Australia's Native Legumes for Novel Food Applications. And this will be presented by Sarah Suzanne Jacob from Coffee Center for Nutrition and Food Science. So if you find out more, so visit us at the Coffee Science Seminar webpage to find out more. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending this seminar series. So if you enjoyed today's seminar, please do a poll at the end of this talk. And if you haven't signed up already to our seminar invitation list, please do so at this address. So I think that's all. Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Okay, bye. Thanks, Albert.
Thanks.